This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. What you're watching is quieter than that and more dangerous, because the most fragile systems don't fail when they're attacked. They fail when they finally respond. For years, authority was treated as optional. Orders became suggestions. Deadlines became theater. Compliance became negotiable. And the system absorbed it silently, patiently, until it couldn't. What happens next isn't about punishment. It's about precedent, about whether rules still mean something when they meet resistance from power, money, and time. Most people assume collapse is loud. It isn't. It sounds like procedure. It looks like paperwork. It arrives wrapped in calm language and narrow deadlines. Stay with me, because once a system decides it must act to preserve itself, it doesn't do it halfway. And what breaks next will not be who you think. We tend to think power lives in people, in titles, in faces we recognize, but that's not what actually controls the system now. What controls it is delay, time as leverage, compliance stretched so thin it begins to feel optional. For years, the system trained itself to tolerate non-response. Missed deadlines, partial answers, endless appeals framed as process, not defiance. And every time the system waited, it taught the same lesson. If you have enough resources, the rules will slow down for you. That's the quiet shift most people missed. Authority stopped being absolute. It became conditional, negotiated, dependent on how loudly someone pushed back. This is not weakness by accident. It's weakness by design. A system built to avoid crisis at all costs eventually forgets how to enforce limits. Until one day, delay stops working. And when that happens, enforcement doesn't arrive as chaos. It arrives as inevitability. Which brings us to how this slow accommodation turned into a trap the system itself can't escape. There was a time when refusal was rare, when orders were final because ignoring them carried immediate consequence. That world didn't disappear overnight. It eroded before authority moved forward. Now, it circles before compliance was assumed. Now, it's negotiated through lawyers, press statements, and time. This shift didn't feel dangerous. It felt procedural, reasonable, even boring. And that's why it worked. Each delay was framed as technical, each exception treated as unique, each deferral justified as caution. But slow change is the most destabilizing kind. Because it doesn't trigger alarms. It retrains expectations. People began to expect that power could resist indefinitely. That accountability was theoretical. That enforcement was optional. If you could endure long enough, the system didn't collapse. It adapted around the resistance. And in doing so, it normalized defiance. That's the moment the balance shifted. Not when someone said no, but when the system learned to live with it. The danger isn't what was ignored then. It's what happens when ignoring is no longer tolerated, because the system only has two modes left: accommodation or force. The first shock never looks like a collapse. It looks like a correction, a narrow order, a specific demand, a deadline that sounds routine if you don't listen closely. This is where the system changes tone. Not louder, sharper. What had been flexible suddenly isn't. What had been delayed is now required immediately. And that's important, because this isn't about what's being demanded. It's about the refusal that came before it. The system doesn't escalate because it wants to. It escalates because every softer option has already failed. This moment feels sudden only if you weren't watching the buildup, but the buildup was years long, layered, documented. This is the point where procedure stops absorbing damage and starts redirecting it. The pressure doesn't spread evenly. It concentrates on one decision, one response, one act of compliance or defiance. And from here on out, every second matters more than the last. Because once enforcement enters the conversation, There is no neutral outcome anymore. Here's the part that's easy to miss. The system doesn't enforce rules to punish, it enforces them to protect itself. Every institution has a breaking point where credibility becomes more valuable than calm. And when that line is crossed, the mechanism flips. What looks like a legal demand is actually a self-defense reflex. Because if refusal is allowed to stand, it doesn't stay isolated. It spreads quietly. Predictably, others learn. They test, they delay. So the system responds not to the content of the defiance, but to the precedent it creates. That's how enforcement really works. Those with resources benefit longest from delay. They turn time into insulation, while everyone else absorbs the cost. Slower justice, weaker rules, eroded trust. But when enforcement finally arrives, it doesn't negotiate. It targets the pressure point that delay can't protect anymore. And once that mechanism engages, the damage stops being shared. It concentrates, which is why the next phase doesn't look like law. It looks like stress. And the system is about to find out who can withstand it. This is where the pace changes. Shorter timelines, tighter language, fewer options. What was once theoretical becomes logistical. Who moves first? Who signs? Who refuses? There's no room left for messaging here. No room for delay dressed up as process. Every action now creates a record. Every pause increases risk. Every refusal sharpens the response. This is how systems apply pressure. Not all at once, but steadily, relentlessly. The cost starts rising faster than it can be managed. Financial strain, institutional exposure. Loss of allies who suddenly see liability instead of protection. At this stage, the system doesn't need to threaten, it just needs to wait. Because delay, the very tool that once protected power, now accelerates its collapse. And that's the trap. There is no move left that doesn't make the next one worse. Compliance ends one crisis. Defiance creates many, and the system has already chosen which outcome it can survive. Now, this is where it reaches you, not as theory, not as politics, as precedent, because the moment a system proves it can't enforce its own limits, those limits stop protecting anyone. You live inside these structures. You rely on them working, even when you're not paying attention. When delay becomes power, rules stop being shields. They become obstacles for you, not for those who can afford to resist them. That's when trust erodes. Quietly, daily. You wait longer. You pay more. You accept less. And you're told that's just how it is now. This isn't about whether you like the person at the center of this moment. It's about whether the system still works when it's inconvenient. Because if enforcement only arrives at the breaking point, then everyone lives closer to collapse. Stay with me. Because the next phase doesn't stay contained inside one country or one institution, systems signal to each other, and this one just sent a message the world is already reading. Institutions don't operate in isolation. They watch each other. When one system hesitates, others adjust. When one enforces, others recalibrate. That's how risk spreads. What begins as a domestic standoff becomes a global signal about reliability, about whether commitments are firm, whether rules will be enforced under pressure. Markets respond first, quietly. Capital hates uncertainty more than it hates accountability. Then governments, allies reassess, adversaries test boundaries. Because if enforcement is selective, it becomes predictable. And predictability invites exploitation. This isn't about embarrassment. It's about credibility. Once a system's authority is questioned, every agreement it touches carries a higher cost. More guarantees, more hedging, more instability. And the system feels that pressure immediately in currency, in influence, in trust. That's why this moment matters beyond headlines. It's not local anymore. The response or lack of it will echo. And those echoes don't fade quickly. They compound, which leaves only one unresolved question. What happens when the system reaches the future it has been delaying? From here, the future splits. Not into certainty, into paths. The first is adjustment. The system enforces just enough to restore credibility. Rules tighten, delays shrink, authority regains shape, but at a cost. Less flexibility, less tolerance, more friction everywhere. The second is erosion. Enforcement arrives, but inconsistently. Enough to signal intent, not enough to deter repetition. The system survives, but thinner, more brittle, more dependent on crisis to function, and then there is rupture. That happens when enforcement comes too late, and resistance has already spread. When the act meant to save legitimacy instead exposes how fragile it is. When compliance triggers instability rather than preventing it. None of these paths are clean. None of them are comfortable. What matters is that the system no longer controls which one unfolds. It only controls how hard it pushes. And pushing always creates reaction. We like to believe the future is decided by choice. Most of the time, it's decided by delay. And delay has already narrowed the options. The system is moving now. Not quickly, not dramatically, but irreversibly. There's a temptation at moments like this to look for resolution, for reassurance, for a clean ending that tells us the system worked and everything is fine. That's not how this ends. Because systems don't reset. They remember every delay, every exception, every time enforcement arrived late instead of early. This moment isn't closure. It's a marker. A line showing how far pressure had to build before authority finally responded. What happens next won't feel dramatic all at once. It will show up in stricter rules, shorter leashes, less patience. You won't be asked whether you want that trade-off. It will arrive as necessity. So pay attention, not to personalities, not to a trade. Watch the mechanisms. Watch how quickly tolerance disappears once credibility is at stake. Because the real danger isn't what happens when the system acts. It's what happens if it learns that it waited too long. If you want to understand where this is heading, not just this case, but the next one, stay with me. The next breakdown doesn't announce itself, and when it does, there won't be time to look away.